Tēnā koutou katoa, nā mihi nui ki a Professor Roel Beetsma, tēnā koe. Nau mai, haere mai ki tēnei hui. Welcome everyone, my name is Mario De Maio. It's wonderful to see you here online for the Treasury guest lecture under the theme of Fiscal Policy for the Future. And a very warm welcome to our presenter, Professor Roel Beetsma. Before I introduce the Professor formally, just a quick word about why we've chosen this topic. Our current theme explores the role of stable, sustainable and effective fiscal policy, and we chose this theme as Treasury is publishing 3 reports during 2025 that will explore these issues. Firstly, the Treasury's next long-term insights briefing is on sustainable and stable fiscal policy over the economic cycle, exploring the role of fiscal policy in stabilising macro outcomes. Secondly, the Treasury will publish our next long-term fiscal statement in late 2025, exploring the trends in expenditure and the challenges in meeting those and having sustainable debt. And lastly, the investment statement, which is an assessment of trends and issues in managing the government's balance sheet and investments, will be published in late 2025. Let me now introduce our speaker, who we're thrilled to have with us today. We really appreciate the flexibility around the time difference role. Roel Beetsma is the Dean of the Faculty of Economics and Business at the University of Amsterdam and Professor of Macroeconomics. He is a member of the European Fiscal Board and the Research Fellow of CEPR and CES-IFO. He is also visiting professor at Copenhagen Business School. Roel was chair of the Dutch Commission on the European Economy and member of the Dutch Government Commission on Second Pillar Pensions. His research has been widely published in journals such as the American Economic Review, the Journal of Economic Literature, and the Economic Journal. About the topic today, Roel is going to talk about the main conclusions in the 2024 annual report of the European Fiscal Board, many of which remain highly relevant for New Zealand. The report emphasises the importance of prudent fiscal management and the need for strong fiscal frameworks and avoiding excessive debt accumulation. Professor recently told me that he just finished a podcast on the issue of the culture of fiscal discipline, and so we'd be interested in hear his views on that. And the report, the presentation today will touch on the European approach to compliance with Stability and Growth Pact and the revisions to that process. Just a few logistics. Roel, I'll invite you to deliver your presentation in a minute, which will be followed by discussion. Please use the Q&A function in Teams to post your questions. If you have technical queries, please use the standard chat functions. Post those questions during the discussion as the issues arise, and at the end, we'll turn over and answer those questions. So, Roel, welcome again, and over to you.
Thank you, Mario. Thank you for having me here. It's a real pleasure to, well, I would have liked to visit in person, but that's, of course, logistically a bit hard. So I think this is, it's still nice that I can do that. So I'm happy to take questions in between. Let me share my screen and the presentation. Just try to find it. Yes, I can now share it. Okay, I suppose you can see this. Then I can go to a second to the full screen. I only want to see whether I can. I only see the screen, but I don't see anything else. So, well, please interrupt me if needed. So, I'm going to present the annual report 24 of the European Fiscal Board. Maybe a few words on the European Fiscal Board. The European Fiscal Board is an independent advisory body of the European Commission. The European Commission is kind of the civil service, so to say, of the European Union. The European Fiscal Board is, makes use of the infrastructure of the Commission, but it is independent. and it exists since 2016. We were appointed in 2016, and the mandate of the current team ends at the end of this week. And so now the European Commission is looking for successors, and they will be appointed when the when the new European Commission has taken office, which will happen in a couple of months. So the annual report has, every year it has basically the same structure, and the structure of the report follows the mandate of the board. So in Chapter 2, we always evaluate the implementation of the European Union fiscal framework. Now, what is this framework? I don't know to what extent you are familiar with the EU fiscal framework, but there's a common set of fiscal rules that say that public deficits should stay below 3% of GDP and public debt below 60%. Now, if a country exceeds those numbers, then a so-called excessive deficit procedure may be started. Actually, when you look at practice, many countries have deficits over 3% and public debt over 60%. And a number of countries are now in the excessive deficit procedure. In Chapter 3, we study the so-called independent fiscal institutions. The second part of our mandate is to cooperate with the so-called national independent fiscal institutions. So each country, or almost each country of the EU, has a so-called independent fiscal institution. I just understood from Mario that New Zealand does not have such an independent fiscal institution, but in the EU, most of the countries now have such institution. And then the third part of our mandate is to assess the so-called euro area aggregate fiscal stance, which is like, treating the EU, not the EU, the Eurozone economy as one economy, and assessing what would be the appropriate fiscal stance for this area. And we do this in Chapter 4 of the annual report, where we go from the year before 23, because so the 24 report deals with the year 23. So in 22, we gave an advice on the appropriate euro area aggregate fiscal stance. So basically, what should be the structural deficit of the Eurozone. And then in 24, we look back at how appropriate was our original advice, and as well as the projections of other institutions. So we basically look back at whether our advice was the right one. And then the final chapter in the annual report deals with suggestions for the future evolution of the fiscal framework. I should say the fiscal framework has been revised recently. That was quite a long process, but it's the new framework. So it's called the Stability and Growth Pact. The new version of the Stability and Growth Pact is in operation since end of April this year. Main messages from the annual report: government deficits remained high in 23, even though COVID measures were phased out. We find that underlying expenditure growth is actually relatively high. It's higher than nominal GDP growth. During the COVID crisis and in the years after that, the Stability and Growth Pact was, de facto suspended. through this so-called severe economic downturn clause. So countries have maximum flexibility to stimulate their economies. The EU fiscal guidance and monitoring that is being done by the European Commission did not pay much attention to these underlying expenditure pressures. So if you kind of peel off the COVID measures, but also the energy support measures, then the underlying expenditure growth is quite high, and that was not paid sufficient attention to. And then there have been delays in decisions on excess deficit procedure recommendations, which I will discuss later on. As I was telling you, the Stability and Growth Pact, the fiscal framework, has been revised. We believe as European Fiscal Board that the revision is an improvement, but still there is, the system is not perfect. Next to final message is that the national independent fiscal institutions, whose position was also strengthened a little bit during the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, still they could be strengthened further. And finally, we believe that the debate on the provision of the so-called European public goods should intensify. For those who are familiar, the budget of the European Union is about 1% of the combined GDP of the European Union, which is very small. If you compare that to the federal budget of the US, that is about 22% or 23%. The budget of the EU is very small. So most of the public expenditures are done at the national level. But there is a lot to say in favor of lifting some of these public goods to the level of the EU. For example, think of these hydrogen infrastructure, etc., which requires large investments and which cannot be done by countries individually. The macroeconomic context. So let me go in a little bit more detail on what happened in the European economy. So this is looking back at the periods from just before the COVID crisis until 23. What we see is that so the nominal GDP growth has been quite high during 21, 22, but also 23. But what we see is that the share of that can be attributed to inflation versus real GDP growth, and the share of inflation has been growing. And you see that in 23, real GDP growth was very small. That happens while at the same time labor markets have been very resilient. Here I show you the headline budget balance of the EU, so of all the countries together. And of course, in 22, it's 7% deficit, which is about half is attributable to COVID support measures and half to other elements. 21 COVID support measures increased relative to the rest, and then energy support measures became more important because of Europe was hit quite hard by energy prices because we were quite dependent on Russian gas. And in 23, actually, the COVID support measures have been phased out completely, and energy support is still there. Most of the deficit is because of kind of traditional sources. This is, in our view, an important figure, an interesting figure. So what we do here, we divide the European Union into low debt countries. Low debt countries are those countries with debt below 60% of GDP. High debt is between 60 and 90% of GDP, and the very high debt countries are those with more than 90% of GDP public debt. Now, what we show here is, so the black bars are medium-term potential growth, and in nominal terms, by the way. So in real terms, but you cannot see this in the figure, it's actually quite low on average. But what we see is that net expenditure growth, that is expenditure growth minus discretionary revenue measures, net expenditure growth is above medium-term potential growth. Now, with regard to net expenditure growth, so the blue boxes, they show just total net expenditure growth. The yellow boxes show net expenditure growth excluding temporary measures, so excluding COVID measures and all that. And what we see is that even though net expenditure growth as a total has been falling for the high debt countries and the very high debt countries, actually net expenditure growth excluding those temporary measures has been going up in all three for all three country groups. For the low debt countries, that may not be such a problem, at least not in the near future, but we see that it has been going up for the high debt countries and also for the very high debt countries. And actually that expenditure growth, excluding those temporary measures, is well above medium-term potential growth. So in the long run, that would not be sustainable, of course. And it's those underlying net expenditure growth that is, that has not been paid enough attention to in our view, and that has to, that may pose a danger to sustainability. This is just briefly summarizing some items that were highlighted in our report, where the maybe the surveillance could have been tighter. One is that I already mentioned the severe economic downturn clause. It was invoked in the beginning of the pandemic, so in 2020, and basically countries had maximum flexibility to stimulate their economies. At the time, the criterion for closing the clause was something like that GDP should get to at the level of 2019 GDP, and that would if once that has happened, the clause would be revoked, but that did not happen. The clause had, because even already I think, if I'm correct, in 22 most countries were above their 2019 level of GDP, but the clause was simply extended actually up to 2023. And in the view of the European Fiscal Board, there was no reason for that. But the European Commission basically referred to very high uncertainty. The side effect of not revoking the clause was that there was less scrutiny of national public finances by the European Commission, and the reporting was very general, just for the entire EU, not going into detail into the details of each individual country. Now in the spring of this year, the European Commission identified. Oh no, sorry, I'm jumping. Well, we saw that in 23 countries, and I showed that in the previous figure, that underlying expenditure growth was relatively high. Countries had deficits many countries had deficits well above 3%, and of course also high debt levels, but the Commission did not launch excessive deficit procedures. I already referred to the uncertainty. And so this was kind of an overview of the, well, in our view, the glitches in surveillance. And as I already explained, the final chapter of our annual report deals with the future evolution of the Stability and Growth Pact. So I want to say a few words on that, because the Stability and Growth Pact, so basically, deficits should be below 3%, debt should be below 60%. This Stability and Growth Pact has evolved since the start of the monetary union in the EU or in Europe in 1999. So there have been a number of revisions, and the most recent revision was concluded this year. But if we go back to 2019, the European Fiscal Board already wrote a kind of a summary report on the adherence to the fiscal rules. So that was 5 years ago. And that was an advice to the Commission, the President of the European Commission. He asked us to give an advice on the EU fiscal rules, so 5 years ago. And the assignment of the Commission President was basically to look at 3 specific items. One was the question, have EU fiscal rules ensured long-term sustainability of public finances? Have they allowed counter-cyclical economic stabilization? And have they improved the quality of the public finances? Now, what is the quality of the public finances? That basically deals with the composition of the public finances. So whether the public finances are sufficiently growth-oriented. So we wrote this advice in 2019, and just to look back a little bit, what has been in a way the performance of the EU fiscal rules. Here I take just a couple of years recently, but it's reflective of what we also saw earlier. So in the years before we wrote the advice, and that is that deficits are generally relatively high, as you see that in the left-hand figure, while public debts are also high. And so so when we look at the deficits, we see that a large fraction of the countries have deficits above 3%, about half of them, and about half of the countries have public debt above 60%. And this is, if I were to show you the picture for the years before 2019, that would be basically the same. The public debts have been going up since that year, I should say, on average. How about the cyclicality of fiscal policies? Have fiscal policies been operated in such a way that they dampen the cycle, the business cycle? Generally speaking, they have not. So this is this figure is again for the, I think it's for the entire EU or maybe only the Eurozone. But what you see is that, so if we look at the years before the global financial crisis, or just during the global financial crisis, we see a negative output gap, and also during those years, so 2008, 2009, there was a substantial fiscal expansion. That is, of course, a counter-cyclical fiscal expansion that should have dampened the output gap. But what we see after 2010, so 2011, 2013, is a pro-cyclical consolidation. The output gap was still negative, but because of the Eurozone debt crisis, a number of countries had trouble to go to the capital market. You see substantial consolidation, especially Italy had to consolidate very substantially. In the years after that, up to the start of the COVID crisis, basically fiscal policy was broadly neutral. Then on the quality of the public finances, here I show two figures where I show the the average government debt depicted against the average net fixed capital formation, and so that's the left figure. And what we see is that basically there seems to be a negative association between government debt and net fixed capital formation. And so the countries with the highest public debt, they on average they invest the least in infrastructures and all that. And the right-hand figure then shows the net fixed capital formation against average potential growth, and we see that those countries with more net fixed capital formation are associated with higher potential growth. Of course, these are not, these are correlations. These are, of course, not, we don't say anything about causality, but it's, it's indicative, so to say. And even though I don't show this here, in our 2019 advice report, we also show that those countries that had the highest levels of public debt, they, during the global financial crisis, they reduced public investment most. And so, for example, Portugal and Italy, which are very high debt countries, precisely these countries, in order to restore their public finances, they reduced their gross fixed capital formation, and that, of course, undermines growth. So, what were the findings from our assessment report? And these basically, they were still true until the system was revised recently. Complex and opaque fiscal rules. The system operated under on unobservable indicators, in particular the structural balance, which is the balance corrected for the business cycle, but it's not observable. So you can always have discussions about the appropriateness of the corrections of the correction for the cycle. And the system is very complicated. So there are multiple indicators like the public deficit, but also the structural balance, expenditure growth, that allow for cherry picking in monitoring. Weak medium-term fiscal planning, and in some papers I show that actually so the plans for the medium term, and so all the fiscal improvement is basically planned to be at the end of the planning horizon. And so the planning is basically backloaded. And so the good intentions, they're always at the end of the planning period. And what we also saw is that political considerations interfere with economic assessment. Basically, so it's the European Commission that has to monitor the adherence to the fiscal framework, but the surveillance by the European Commission has become increasingly bilateral. So it's the Commission that engages in the discussion with the member states of the EU, and other countries are not always able to see what is being discussed. At the time, when we wrote the advice, we also already came up with an advice on how to reform the Stability and Growth Pact. At the time, we advised a simplification in which we would have only one fiscal anchor, that is a debt ceiling of 60%, one operational indicator, an expenditure benchmark, and one escape clause that would do away with all the existing flexibility provisions. And also importantly, we advised that the economic analysis that is being done by the Commission staff, that would be separated from the political decisions. So there's the so-called commissioners, so basically the top of the building of the European Commission, that is the political level, and they take the political decisions. And so our advice was to have a clear separation between these two levels. This has been kind of overtaken by the development, so let me not go into this. But let me also say a few words on the governance. The governance is quite complicated in the EU, because the EU consists of 27 countries, but only 20 countries are member of the euro area, and so they share the common currency. And there's a so-called ECOFIN, that is the Council of the Ministers of Economics and Finance of the European Union, and so of all the 27 member states. They have the monthly meetings, but then on top of that, there is the so-called Eurogroup, and that is basically the meeting of the 20 Eurozone countries. And the Eurozone has a president, and the president is one of the finance ministers, and he or she has 2 years of presidency. And you can see that domestic political calculations and all that might interfere with her or his role as president of the Eurogroup. And so our advice was to replace the part-time position of president by a full-time position of president, and that it would not be filled by a sitting finance minister, to have more separation of those national interest and and his role as representing the Eurogroup. So these were our advices at that time. As I was saying, the system has been reformed quite recently. Some of our advice has found its way into the revised Stability and Growth Pact. Not all of our advice, but some of it. And the reform that eventually materialized centers around a number of key principles. Rather than having merely an annual approach to surveillance, a more medium-term approach has been taken, and that is through the so-called medium-term fiscal structural plans. And I will say a few words on that later on. Also, the revised system should give more incentives for reforms and investments, and countries submit so-called medium-term fiscal structural plans. These are plans for a 4-year period, but this can be extended to 7 years if the country comes up with good proposals for reforms, structural reforms and investments. Gradual and credible debt reduction. I already showed a figure in which you saw that debt positions are very different across countries. And so this would be, the new system would lead to a differentiated fiscal path and to reflect the public debt challenges. More national ownership, and so it's the European Commission that does the surveillance, but many countries basically, if something goes wrong, they point to the European Commission as being the source of their problems, and so the idea was to have in the revised system to have more national ownership of the more own responsibility to put the public finances in order, and multilateral approach, so to use common methodologies for the medium-term fiscal structural plans that countries have to adhere to. Also, simplification was one of the key principles, and better enforcement of the so-called excessive deficit procedures. Now, how does the process take place? What happens at the beginning of a planning period of 4 or 7 years is that, and that has happened now, that has happened just very recently, the European Commission provides countries with too high deficits or too high debt with a so-called reference trajectory. And the reference trajectory it satisfies a number of criteria, but the idea of the reference trajectory is that countries with too high deficits or too high debt will correct these over the adjustment period. Now, this is the Commission which sets the reference trajectories, and they have not been published yet. And the country takes the reference trajectory, and it may then come up with its own plan that should be at least as strict as the reference trajectory. And that is done after there has been a dialogue, a technical dialogue between the country and the European Commission. The next step is, so reference trajectories have been provided by the Commission. Countries, quite a few countries have now come up with the medium-term fiscal structural plan. I don't think all of them have, but a number of them have. And then the Commission will provide an assessment of the plan. And the Commission assessment then goes to the Council of Ministers of Finance and Economics, and it's the Council, and that's these are the political decision makers. The Council, they decide whether to endorse the plan or not, and then the execution of the plan starts, and the Commission and the Council, they monitor the implementation. And if a country runs too high, so if a country fails to correct its deficit, so if deficit is too high, then the so-called deficit-based excessive deficit procedure may be opened. If expenditure growth is too faster than according to the plan, then the so-called debt-based excessive deficit procedure may be opened. That has not been done so far, but that is now a possibility. Now, I mean, we are at the beginning of the revised of the implementation of the revised system. So we will need to see the proof is in the eating of the pudding. So we will see how it works. But the system, the idea was to simplify the system, but it's still very complicated, and a lot of details still need to be resolved. We think that the revised system is an improvement upon the previous system, but we also think that a number of opportunities have been wasted during the revision process. One is that on the role of the national independent fiscal institutions, the revision of the Stability and Growth Pact, or of, well, should actually say the economic governance system more generally, would have been an opportunity to strengthen the national independent fiscal institutions. That was also the proposal of the European Commission, but governments did not want this. So the national IFIs have been strengthened marginally. Their mandate has been expanded marginally, but not as much as would have been desirable in our view. Independence is not always as strong as you would like to have. Then I was already alluding to the complicatedness, the complexity of the system, because well, there are many complexities, but one is that the EU fiscal surveillance framework is now based on medium-term budgetary planning, but of course, governments, they work on an annual basis, so they submit budget plans for the coming year. And so how can one better align the national budgetary procedures with those of the EU framework? And finally, in the beginning, I mentioned the so-called European public goods. The European public goods, or central financing of certain expenditures that have a public good nature, that has not been part of the revision of the framework, basically because it was not politically expedient to do that. Some countries are very, well, basically the net payers into the EU system. They are generally very reluctant to have more spending at the central level. So that was not possible politically, but I would expect that in the future, the need for those European public goods will become more visible, and so there will be a need for more European public goods. For example, common defense policy, maybe a common air defense system, or I was also mentioning infrastructures like hydrogen, also strengthening of or upgrading of electricity networks, etc. So that will probably become, this discussion will become stronger in the near future. So let me stop here, and here is the web address of the European Fiscal Board, which you could, of course, I would invite you to visit it. And so let me thank you and take questions.
Thank you, Roel, for your presentation. You've covered such a large amount of territory and a real tour de force of thinking about how do you advise governments, 27 of them, about what their appropriate macro stance is, through to how do you think about setting rules within a common currency area for fiscal discipline so you don't have these spillover events. One observation that I had was, there's always been this debate about the right approach to setting fiscal rules. Is it best to have rules that are very clearly articulated and provide little flexibility so you can hold governments to accounts, or is it better to have an approach which is more principled based, where you try and aim for transparency and require the government to set out that? And it's interesting to see the evolution of the European approach, which I think initially, because of the importance of trying to underpin the monetary union, you went for some very tight principles, but then over time it becomes quite challenging to implement those principles, and moving now to an approach that is, I guess, simpler and more nationally based. It's going to be interesting to see how the Commission grapples with that. I wondered if I could perhaps use my privilege as a chair to to pick up on something that you mentioned before we started, which was, I guess, this podcast that you've done that sort of hinted at in the introduction of the chair of the Fiscal Board in the annual report about what is the political context, the political economy around fiscal adjustment in the European Union, and how does that play out after two very large shocks? We have had, COVID shock, and then in the European context, an energy price shock. So I'd be interested in your reflections on what you discussed in the podcast and how that might play out over the next little while with the adjustment required.
Yeah. So thank you, Mario. So these are very interesting questions, and maybe I can go back to what you started with. That is tight, unflexible rules versus more principle-based. And in the EU, one should realize that all the decisions are eventually made by the politicians. So I mentioned the Council of Finance Ministers, Finance Economics. One representative from each country. They vote on whether an excessive deficit procedure should be opened or not. So it's always, so the Commission makes a proposal, but it's always the politicians that decide. And there have been instances in 2016 when there was a clear case for imposing sanctions on Spain and Portugal for transgressing the rules. And actually, it was the German finance minister who put, and Germany is a fiscally very, strict country, but it was the German finance minister who put pressure on the Commission not to propose sanctions. So it's the politicians that eventually decide. And you see that back now, maybe even more in the aftermath of the COVID crisis and the still ongoing Russia-Ukrainian conflict. So what we saw during COVID was, of course, massive support for, in our case, it was for businesses. In the US, it was more for consumers, but in Europe, it was for businesses. Massive support. Then we had the start of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. So energy became much more expensive. There was massive support, and so subsidies. Each country had its own approach, and so deficits, they shot up. Public debt jumped, and for very high debt countries, the jump in the public debt was also the biggest. And basically what it seems that, and even in my country, so the Netherlands, which is traditionally a fiscally conservative country, spending went through the roof, so to say. And I think this is in a way, is a general phenomenon. So a big crisis means, the government gets a bigger grip on the economy, spending increases, and actually the attitude of the population in general is, the government should solve my problems, and too high spending is not an issue anymore. And so the discipline culture, or at least this is, in my view, the discipline culture has disappeared to a large extent. Also, for example, in my country. And if there's no discipline culture, then it is very difficult to have governments adhere to fiscal rules. It's in the end, there should be public support for those rules. Otherwise, it's you can write everything in stone, but it will not function if there is no public and no political support for it.
Yeah, no, that's a very good comment. I've got a question here in the chat, Professor, which asks you to reflect a little bit on the role of the European Fiscal Board. So the question is, fiscal boards are meant to enhance the credibility of fiscal rules. Yet what you've explained to us is a sort of a history of numerous rule breaches and suspensions, most notably during crisis. So can you reflect on how you think about the European Fiscal Board's role in holding folks to account, and what would your counterfactual be if the board had not been in place?
Yeah, so you see, actually, when we started our work as European Fiscal Board 8 years ago, we were of the the view, and I think it's still the view is still correct, is that the fiscal rules are not perfect, and there have been many breaches already at that time, because the European Fiscal Board was set up in response to complaints by some countries that the European Commission was not strict enough in its monitoring and surveillance. And but still, so even though there have been many breaches, I think that the fiscal rules have had a kind of a moderating effect on the behavior of the governments. And so if the fiscal rules had not been there, then deficits would have been higher. And so, for example, take France. France is a country, it's a large country within the EU. It largely goes its own way, but the 3% deficit level, that number is quite, how you say, now has sunk into the kind of the public, into the consciousness of the French. And so the fiscal rules have had an effect. And so this is also how I see our role. I mean, we don't, we contribute just, our little bit to, moderating the government's behavior. And I think that's the same of independent fiscal institutions in general. They, they have some influence. Some have more influence than others. They have some influence on government behavior, but of course they do not fully correct government behavior.
Yeah. Can I ask you a follow-up? One of the roles of your board is, I think you said coordination or collaboration maybe with the fiscal councils across the European Union and the Eurogroup. We saw that, post GFC, many countries established these institutions, I think maybe in response to learnings and maybe as a response of a common European agreement that this was a requirement. Can you reflect on, where you see the most successful institutions? Like, what are the characteristics of where you see success?
Yeah. That's a good question. Maybe just a few words on our collaboration with the independent fiscal institutions. We are collaborating with them, and we don't have any authority over them. To them, this is very important. Because they set up their network in response, so they have a network, and they set it up in response to the, the establishment of the European Fiscal Board. So they gather independence very, they're very strong-minded about that. But you see, I think in my view, one of the most successful independent fiscal institutions is the so-called Central Planning Bureau in the Netherlands. It has it's called the Netherlands Bureau of Economic Policy Analysis, because central planning doesn't sound very nice, but in Dutch it's called Central Planning Bureau. And that has been in place since the 50s, or I think it's since the 50s. It was founded by Tim Bergen, who later got the Nobel Prize. And it has acquired a good reputation over time. So it exists for a long time, and it was, at the start of it, there was a person who was very highly regarded and, lent the institution credibility. That is an example of a successful institution, but there are more institutions that are successful or that are perceived as fulfilling a very useful role. To mention a couple of them, the Italian independent fiscal institution, the Spanish, and the Portuguese. And so take the Spanish. The Spanish one was presided by José Luis Escrivá, who was also the chair of the network at the time, and who is, I think he's now the central banker of Spain. And José Luis was really, he actually took the government to court because of not sharing information. So, this was an institution with very strong leadership, but also with quite substantial resources. Like the Central Planning Bureau, our Central Planning Bureau, the IMF, the Spanish one, has quite substantial resources. So they have, I think they have about 60 people with quite strong, analytical capacity. So they can actually, delve into the details of the public finances. They can, make computations. They are able to make projections because they have the analytical capacity. And I think this is quite important because otherwise you would, if you are very small, and a number of the IFIs are small, they just have a couple of people, very few support staff, then you're completely dependent on the information that you get from the government, and you are not able to, to cross-check what the government is doing. And so I think sufficient resources are essential, but also independent, budgetary independence, say a separate credit line in the budget, being politically independent of the politicians. So, you could, the higher the level of the law in which you enshrine the independence, the more guarantee that you have that you can do your work independently. And so there is, and I wrote a so-called briefing paper for the European Parliament about 1.5 years ago, in which I discussed these independent fiscal institutions and what are the the sources of and what are the factors that drive their success. And so it's enough resources, not being the resources should be protected. Appointments should be, made. There should be maybe, they should choose their own successors or something like that. But the appointments is very important, and the ability to do your work independently, and so without political interference.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Do you mind if I take you in a slightly different direction? I guess, post GFC in Europe, you mentioned in your presentation, but was also one of the factors in trying to redesign the Stability and Growth Pact, was that many countries appeared to reduce the level of public investment as a means to protect or as a consequence of the challenge of reducing spending on social protection and other things. And this resulted in a decade or more of very low public investment in some of these economies. And I guess people became concerned that this was undermining the growth potential in some of these economies. And so I wondered if you could speak to how the reforms to the Stability and Growth Pact give adequate emphasis to this issue of, yes, we want fiscal consolidation, but it needs to be in a manner that actually supports long-term productive capacity in the economy.
Yeah, so this is many countries in Europe, basically, I guess basically all countries in Europe, maybe except for the Scandinavian countries, they have a problem with long-term growth. And so potential growth is quite low, especially in Southern Europe. It's low, and that has to do with population aging, but it also has to do with investments, low investment levels, both public and private. We don't have a capital markets union yet, and so it's so savings don't flow to those places where the risk-corrected returns are highest. You see, the previous version of the Stability and Growth Pact had certain clauses that so countries have to reach a certain structural balance. And in the adjustments, there were certain clauses that provided for, say, maybe slower adjustment because of investments and structural reforms. It actually turns out that the countries did not make too much use of that flexibility, which is an indication that they did not do too much public investment. Now the new system, it actually it emphasizes both fiscal sustainability, but also long-term growth or sustainable growth and resilience. So in principle, the new system puts more emphasis on reforms and investments. And countries can, so they have to come up with a medium-term fiscal structural plan that has to cover 4 years, but they can ask for an extension to up to 7 years if they come up with good plans for reforms and investments. So that whether this incentive is sufficient, we do not know yet. We expect some countries to ask for such an extension, but they have to come up with proposals. And then, of course, the question is on the monitoring of these, whether they actually execute these plans for reforms and investments. And we don't have any experience with that yet. So we would need to see how that unfolds. The thing is that so you have an extension of the adjustment period, but of course, in the end, investments, of course, they add, if you make more investments and you don't reduce, say, spending on welfare, etc., then of course the public debt will rise further. And so one also, of course, needs to also look at the integral picture of the public finances. You see, it has become politically more and more difficult to prioritize growth-friendly spending over welfare spending.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. I have a question that is a little bit more technical, Professor. Like my understanding is that the Stability and Growth Pact rules pre-2019 focus very heavily on these concepts of structural balance, when we're trying to separate out the cycle and close that. But under the new revision, we have more of a concept of, correct me if I'm wrong, but an expenditure growth target that is consistent, or a net expenditure growth target that is consistent with the country's potential growth. Is that right? So yeah. Instead of being a concept that's not observable, it's much more a focus on actually what we can observe. Can you explain the thinking behind that and whether that's improved the focus of countries on things that they can control and reduce the debate, how do we calculate potential growth, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So indeed, the previous version of the Stability and Growth Pact focused on the structural balance, and countries were supposed to attain a so-called medium-term objective. And so that's a structural balance of, well, it depends on the level of the debt, but say, what is between -1% and 0. And the problem, of course, with the structural balance is that it is not observable, not directly observable, and there is a so-called, or there was, because now it is renamed, has been renamed, there was a so-called output gap working group or something like that, which dealt with all the technicalities of the, of the correction for the cycle to get to the structural balance. And I mean, you can imagine, and that is very complicated, but the result is, you can always discuss about the result. And besides that, in the surveillance, the Commission not only looked at the structural balance, but also at expenditure growth. And so you had basically two indicators, which, gives rise to cherry picking in the monitoring, etc. Now, so now there is a single indicator. The single indicator is the net primary expenditure growth. And so the idea is to have an indicator that is, that basically consists of something that is under the control of the government. So the focus is now on the single indicator net expenditure growth, net primary expenditure growth. So that is public expenditure minus interest payments, but also minus the cyclical component of unemployment benefits, minus a number of other items. So to get to an indicator that is under the control of the government. And this indicator should not grow faster than potential output, or than, well, I would say medium-term potential output. But in addition, the growth of this indicator should also be such that countries that have too high public debt, that they reduce the public debt. And so a country with, say, 100% public debt should have a growth of net primary expenditure indicator that is below potential output growth. Otherwise, the public debt will not fall. And so we have an indicator that is under the control of the government, but that is also not affected by the business cycle. And because, the indicator excludes cyclical elements like the cyclical part of the unemployment benefits, and it corrects for discretionary revenue measures. So you get to an indicator that is under the control of the government, and that is not affected by the business cycle, or not, at least not directly affected by the business cycle.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you. Professor, it was interesting to hear you talk about the need for public support for fiscal discipline. So, as part of its role in coordinating fiscal boards and fiscal institutions across Europe, so how has the European Fiscal Board thought about contributing to the public debate? And I guess the second part of this question is, does that specifically involve raising awareness about these very long-term sustainability challenges for public finance associated with healthcare, pension spending, defence requirements?
Yeah, so that is an interesting question, because the European Fiscal Board is actually, well, how do you say? I mean, we started only 8 years ago. We are not, there's not much public awareness of us. And we publish only 2 reports a year, except for 2019, when we published this advice for the Commission President. So our our publications are first and foremost directed at the European Commission itself. And so the first presentation of the report will always be to the so-called College of Commissioners, so the commissioners of the EU. And we have two publications each year. One is in June, which deals with the advice on the euro area aggregate fiscal stance, and so taking the eurozone as a, as one economy. And in October we publish the annual report. And we try to participate in events and etc. But it's quite difficult to, how you say, to achieve broad awareness of our activities. I mean, policymakers read it, ministries of finance and people at central banks, but we still have quite a lot of work to do in this respect, and we are also bound a little bit by our mandate. Our mandate is, quite precisely described. Issues like, for example, the governance of the fiscal system, or more broadly, the governance of economic policies. In our advice to the Commission President at the time, we also gave some advice on the governance, and we kind of got, a response. Well, maybe you went a little bit too far in your advice. I don't remember the precise wordings, but the mandate is also somewhat of a constraint on what we do and what we say.
Okay, that's very useful. I've got another question here, Professor, that comes at it from a different angle, which is how can the EU maintain fiscal discipline if markets perceive an implicit guarantee for member states? And I think this reflects to the European stability mechanism, but also the central role in sort of post-crisis capital markets. Do you have any reflections, I guess, staying within your mandate, I guess, on this issue?
Yeah, so this is, of course, we've seen that we've had several crises since the turn of the century. We saw that, that was basically the case during each crisis, that there is such an implicit guarantee. It's the European Central Bank during in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. So with the start of the Eurozone debt crisis, the European Central Bank started the security markets program, so in which it bought public debt. Since 2015, there have been asset purchase programs in which public debt was bought on the secondary market, but of course it makes placing new public debt easier. And so I think, and when you look at spreads, and we always look at the spread against Germany, because Germany pays the lowest interest rate on its public debt, we saw that at least up to the global financial crisis, spreads were very, very small. Even countries that had very high public debt, they paid just a small margin over of the German interest rate. Since then, spreads have widened, but they have also, how you say, compressed. And I think that, and you also saw that, I think that was during the the most recent crisis, so the energy crisis, when the European Central Bank established a new program, the so-called transmission protection instrument, which was, it has not been activated yet, but it's an instrument through which the European Central Bank can buy public debt if spreads become too large. Then, of course, the announcement of that led to a reduction in spreads. So I think there's always a perception of an implicit guarantee. And that, of course, how you say, gives, avoids abrupt turbulence in financial markets, but it has also, of course, incentive effects on governments.
Well, thank you very much for your time today, Roel, and we've run out of time, so I think I'll bring the meeting to a close. We're very grateful to you for taking the time and late in your evening after a long day to share your insights and experience with us. The issues that you've touched on are, facing us at the moment. As I said, the Treasury's core stewardship reports, which are public facing, are all focused on these issues. I'd like to thank everyone else for joining us on the talk today, and thank you for the questions. Just a small advertisement: on November 13th, we'll hear from Dr. Alan Bollard, who's Professor of Practice at the School of Government, former Governor of the Reserve Bank, of course, Secretary to the Treasury, and Chair of the Infrastructure Commission, Te Waihanga. Please remember, if you haven't, to sign up on our mailing list, and we'll let you know about these coming seminars. You'll find the link on our website. Let me close our seminar today. Piki te kaha, piki te ora, piki te wairua, hui e taiki e. Thank you everyone for attending, and good evening, Professor.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure for me. Thank you. Goodbye.